a couple of minutes for people to get on. I'm going to first say that I'm Scott Benner. This is Jenny Smith. You may know Jenny and I from the Diabetes Pro Tip episodes on the Juicebox Podcast. Jenny also does Ask Scott and Jenny and Defining Diabetes. And today we thought we would do an Ask Scott and Jenny live. Now, we have a question to get started with that came from one of you, but we're totally willing to see some questions from other people. So first, I need somebody in the chat on Facebook to tell me if you can hear me. And Jenny, say something, see if they can hear you.
Hello.
Okay. Somebody tell me in the comments if you can hear us. Oh, hi, Maddie. How are you? Have you never seen Jenny live before? We already have 18 people.
Awesome.
24. We'll start right at 3 o'clock because you guys are on time. I like prompt.
They've got a minute or maybe less. I don't know. My clock says 1:59 or 2:59. So
it should definitely be, everybody can hear. Cool. All right. They should definitely be rewarded for being on time. The people who come later are going to have to watch the replay or hear it on the podcast. I can hear both of you. All right, Laura, thank you.
Woohoo.
All right. So if you guys have questions, throw them in there and we'll see what we can do. But Jenny and I thought we would start with, let's see, I have it here. Here it is. Oh, you know what? Before we start, did you guys know that, Jenny, I'm going to give your bona fides here. Jenny Smith is an RD, LD, CDE, T1D. She has a bachelor's degree in human nutrition and biology from the University of Wisconsin. She's a registered and licensed dietitian, a certified diabetes educator, and a certified trainer on most makes of pumps and continuous glucose monitoring systems. Jenny has had type 1 diabetes for how long, Jenny?
On May 15th, it will be 32 years.
Okay, so that's a long time.
That's a long time.
That is definitely a long time. So any of you who have heard us on the show before know this is basically what it looks like for Jenny and I when we record, and you guys just don't usually get to hear. So we're going to get started with the first question.
Yay.
It's, how do I attack meals or times of day that cause a huge spike but come down eventually? If more insulin is added, I go low later. When I wait longer, like when I pre-bolus, I go low earlier in the meal. Now, by the way, guys, there's a disclaimer here. We're not healthcare professionals. This is not advice. In this just us talking and you hanging out. So if everybody's okay with that, cool. If you're not, jump. All right.
Jump ship now.
You're not any problems for you people. Just get it. You don't like it. All right, Jenny. So I hear this question a lot. I tried to pre-bolus, but I got low before I ate, or, I tried a shorter pre-bolus and I just got high later. What are some of the reasons that can happen?
So to begin with, beginning of the question would be you're bolusing, getting high, and eventually without correction, it comes down. That initially would be a bolus timing thing, right? Where you need to bolus sooner to stop the rise. It's an indication that there is enough insulin there because ultimately the bolus you took does get you down to where you wanted to get later after the meal. There's just not enough time between taking the insulin, letting it get started, and the food actually impacting blood sugar. But the further part of the question sounds more like if you add more insulin, like upfront thinking there wasn't enough to begin with, or you correct and then you end up going low in either of those scenarios, clearly there was too much insulin, right? You didn't need more insulin. You just needed a different bit of timing for taking it.
Right.
The third part of it, so like little segments here, the third part of it really is if you do take the amount based on your ratio, you end up climbing, or you pre-bolus with enough time and you end up sinking within the time period after you bolus, but then you still climb up later. That could be, especially for those who are using an insulin pump, that could be not only a timing issue, but also a delivery of insulin issue, right? Where you would probably need to use, all the pumps have some type of extended bolus feature. Could it be combo bolus, extended bolus, dual or square wave bolus? All the pumps call it something different. But essentially it allows you to take a certain percentage up front, potentially in this scenario to stop the bump up, gives you, let's say you decided to take 50% of the bolus now, and then distribute the other 50% in the back end. What it allows is the 50% you take now, you can pre-bolus, thus decreasing the amount at the beginning that you get. So you don't have a drop, but you also get the pre-bolus benefit of not having that rise up soon after the meal. And then the later impact is that you still get a finish of that end of insulin, which you knew was enough. You just needed to distribute it a little bit longer to impact, the full content of whatever this meal, I guess, had in it.
Okay. And I obviously I agree with you, but what I was going to say is that when I see that, I don't often see a pre-bolus that's so like heavy that she crashes before she gets low. And so I think that ends up being a situation where people are like, well, I pre-bolused and then I got high anyway, so I'll keep trying longer and longer and longer. But it's not, at some point, the length of the pre-bolus is just not your issue.
Right.
And I don't want to put a number on it, but if you're pre-bolusing 30 minutes in the future, you're probably coming out of a much higher blood sugar to begin with, and you have issues on the back end that you're not dealing with. I find myself saying a lot that diabetes, using insulin specifically, is like time travel. Everything you do now is for later, right?
Right.
But everything that's happening to you now is from before. So if you're putting in a healthy pre-bolus, like you said, on a good site that you can count on, etc., and you're still climbing afterwards, I mean, the pre-bolus probably at this point isn't the question. And there's little things for CGM users. You can kind of look at the
trend,
the angle of the trend, right? So if you're shooting straight up like this, you've either missed, I think, huge with the amount of insulin you're using, or if you just bolus and 5 minutes later start eating a real sugary thing, you're going to shoot straight up. If you come more on that kind of gentle rise that I tried to describe as it's the minor, or no, not the minor, like the mountain climber on The Price is Right.
Right.
And he like keeps like rolling back and forth like this, right? Because when you have a Dexcom and you have that gradual line up, everyone's done it. They stare at it. They're like, it's going to stop. It's going to stop. It's going to stop. And then eventually that guy falls off the end, and Harry says you can't have the money, and it's all over, right? And your blood sugar's 280, and then that's sort of the end of it. So like Jenny's saying, there's just 1,000 different ways, but in the end, what you're trying to do is manipulate your insulin and put it where it's needed. So you need that nice pre-bolus, but if an hour later you start having this crazy rise, like she said, an extended bolus, or even coming back and readdressing with more insulin at some point is the answer. You get low later when you put so much insulin up front to control that line, that eventually when the impact of the food goes away out here in the future, the insulin's still left over and you crash low. So you've got to, for the lack of a better term, you have to put the insulin where it's needed. I always say when you're, you have to address your body's need with the right amount of insulin. So that's cool. So it's a great question. Appreciate that question. And people have left other questions.
Woohoo.
Dig in here, Jennifer, and see what
we love questions, right?
Yeah, but I'm on the wrong browser to see. I got to get into. All right, everybody, chill out a second. This is my first time doing this. It's a lot of pressure, like running the show and like
asking the questions and answering them.
I was going to feel under pressure here. Hold on a second. All right. I'm on a different browser. So one browser is sending you guys the Facebook Live, and then I'm going to look on a different one. Where am I looking at? Oh, I'm in the wrong. I have too many Facebook groups.
While you're looking, I'm going to add something extra to that comment.
Thank you.
And question from before too. You were talking about, the trend kind of even coming into the meal, and that can definitely determine things. If you were at an excessive insulin coming into a meal and you were already on this slope headed down, and or if that's commonly happening within the same meal time, it could be that you're pre-bolusing with a load of extra previous insulin on board. Thus, you're consistently coming down in this time period of the day. And so any pre-bolus, it's going to look like that pre-bolus is causing you to drop within the first time period of that meal. So you're less likely to pre-bolus as much as you need to from previous experience. And thus you're getting this rise up that you wouldn't have if the hours leading into this meal, again, if it was a consistent problem at this time of day. It sounds like the hours ahead in this setting could need to be evaluated. Maybe the basal's too high heading into this meal.
Okay.
Or maybe the insulin to carb from a snack 3 hours ago is also giving you too much insulin. So you're consistently coasting down into this meal time. So you've got this excess behind the scenes insulin. So there are some other things that could be evaluated too.
Cool. All right. And somebody said I was lower than you, so I just turned my voice up. So if I'm now too loud, somebody tell me. All right. Anna asks, I have been having trouble with the accuracy of my Freestyle Libre. Sometimes there's a big difference. I think I will change to Dexcom once I finished my inventory I currently have at home, but do you have any recommendations in the
meantime
while I'm using these?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything to adjust? There's nothing from our practice. All of us within our practice at Integrated, we've all used the Libre. All got our trial, a couple of sensors to try out. And I tried it, as many people often do. You make yourself the guinea pig, right? You try a couple products at one time to see what's actually right. So I wore my Dexcom along with the Libre, and the 3 sensors of the Libre that I wore, they were all consistently reading lower than my actual sensed Dexcom and finger stick values were consistently. Sensor to sensor, they were all consistently different. And enough that from a blood sugar and a meal bolus and a correction standpoint strategy, it would have been enough of a difference to make adjustments kind of difficult to base off of.
Okay.
Is there anything that you can do about it? In this setting, what we usually recommend is for the prime times that insulin is going to be dosed based on a glucose value, do a finger stick.
Okay.
Get a finger stick and dose off the finger stick, dose off of your Libre. What you can know from any sensor system that might be reading a little bit off or different than it should be, is that while there is a difference in the number, the trend is still it's still a value for you. So you can still tell whenever you're trending up or trending down, and you can use that to your advantage for future planning.
Okay.
But you wouldn't necessarily dose off the value.
So Adam, I guess what Jenny's saying is when you find you're not trusting the device, test, but still look for, I guess I've never used the Libre, but arrows and direction and rate of change and stuff like that. And then when you really need to know, I guess what we're saying is that if it's a pre-meal and it says you're 120, but you think you might be 150, that's important to know when you're making your bolus.
Right.
Okay. But it's still important. I don't want to minimize the idea that a big difference is a problem, but at least you can be safe when you're putting in more.
When you're putting in insulin. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, cool.
But it's to let her know that that's not uncommon.
Gotcha.
A lot of people find the variance there.
It's going to be hard to keep. See, we only have an hour, so I need to keep Jenny moving, but Jenny will talk and get all her knowledge out. And then we're going to answer one of your questions if we do that. So, Maddie, how do you, Jenny, see CGM being used in patient hospital settings now that we're seeing COVID-19 era? How is it going to help diabetics? And Maddie, what I'll say to you is, did you hear the episode of the podcast that went up today? Because Dr. Dan DeSalvo came on and talked about how Dexcoms are being used in hospitals right now. So I have something to add, but you go first.
That's pretty awesome, because I've not obviously listened. I've been working with people all day. So I have both pro and con feelings to it. Pro from the standpoint that, great, there's a lot more information, there's a lot more data. It can be beneficial. On the con side, however, there's a lot of data, and healthcare workers in hospital who we already know have little experience with type 1 consistent glucose information management. They are used to doing finger sticks every several hours to base decisions on, right? Whether it's dosing or whatever adjustments in doses. With all of this extra information, the trends, the alarms, the things that are going to be visible to them, there's no quick education that can be done within 10 minutes to the thousands of healthcare nurses, doctors, whoever that's looking at this information to help the person wearing it.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a lot of information. They're not going to know what to do with it.
So
That's what I feel like. I feel like it's good, but it's also, I don't know.
well, let me share with you what Dan said. Dr. DeSalvo told me that what it was really helpful with in the moment was it was preserving PPE for nurses because
Mhm.
they were, they do finger sticks on patients a lot. And
Mhm.
now you're asking them to go in and out and change their gear every time. So now they're, I guess Dexcom, if I heard him right, gave the patients like Android phones. And so there's a cloud service. And now the nurses are able to look at the patients through
Outside the room.
through the share and follow, right? And
Sure.
then they're like, okay, they come down the line, and then here's Mary, and Mary's blood sugar is this. It seems pretty reasonable. I don't need to go in there. So that was the idea. What I heard while he was talking was it's a great opportunity nationwide for healthcare professionals to see how glucose monitoring works, right? And maybe in the future things will go better. Like I told him a story of when Arden had a surgery, and the nurse didn't know anything about it. I just kept talking to nurses till I found one who's like, I have a friend who has diabetes. I go, you're my friend now. Come over here and explain to all these people why we
Right.
need to leave this CGM on her during this procedure. But anyway, that's what I thought of it, Maddie. I think it's great for that saving of the PPE. And on the other side, I think it's a good first step in bringing the technology out to people. So
It is. Yeah. I also think, in that scenario, as if they're using it based on the protocol that they would have used finger sticks and they're only checking at certain points to see
mhm.
what the values are or responding to alarms, yeah, it's absolutely valuable. I just hope that I would expect somebody has schooled them in what to pay attention
Yeah.
to and what not to.
My thought was is that it was going to be used in a really, I don't know, like a limited way in the beginning, just to keep, from being with people. I saw Donnie ask about managing weight with type 1. So, and he said
Yeah.
thank you for being here. So thank you very much, Donnie, for being here as well. Yeah, best way to tackle losing weight for type 1. Why can people with diabetes who are using insulin have trouble with weight loss?
The first thing is definitely insulin management.
Okay.
That's a huge piece of it because insulin is a storage hormone. It's meant to move food, glucose out of the system into the cells. Either it gets used by your muscles or it gets packed away into fat, right? So, from a physiology standpoint, even if you look at a body that doesn't have diabetes, if you out eat what you really need, then overall your body can only pack away that extra calorie, right? And
Okay.
it does it with insulin, right? To manage the normal blood sugars that should be there. Same thing is happening though. And so a person even without diabetes can gain weight. That's how they gain weight. Essentially, their body's just packing away more than what they needed because their body is managing blood sugar the right way. In a body with diabetes, though, because insulin management is something that we control, the body's no longer doing it for us, it's something that we have to adjust more precisely than people are often given tools to manage,
Okay.
right? So overall, one, make sure that your baseline dose, that Basil, is right to begin with.
Mhm.
It's in the right place. Then the next thing to tackle is the food management, the strategizing around meals, timing. So you're not using more insulin to cover than you actually need to. You're not covering with extra food when drops happen because you used too much insulin that you didn't really need to have there.
Right.
And then the other piece, of course, beyond that is, are you eating what your body needs to eat?
Mhm.
Because if even in this case, if you've got great looking blood sugars, but you're constantly like popping food in and covering it with insulin, you could have wonderful looking blood sugar values. You could still be out eating what you need.
Right.
So,
So, it's funny. I saw John pop in and he said, don't feed your insulin, which is what I was going to say. I think that when people who listen to the podcast there's two trains of thought. When you're learning how to use the insulin in the beginning, I will say, be more aggressive. You can always have juice later. I don't mean that for the rest of time in memoriam. I mean, while you're figuring it out, like if you continue to bolus and get low, fix the bolus. Don't keep drinking juice. But it's a great point because people with type 1 can start to think of diabetes first and instead of health, right? So
right.
all of a sudden an Oreo cookie is not a bad thing because I need it because I'm getting low. Except your real issue is you need to stop yourself from getting low so you don't have to eat an unscheduled Oreo. And by the way, don't eat
Right.
Oreos. They're poison. But like They really, I don't think there's any food in them whatsoever. But my point is that don't feed the insulin, but learn the steps so that you can do that. And Jenny, this is a wonderful place to say that diabetesprotip.com is now open and available to find all the diabetes pro tips with Jenny and I, all in one place in case you guys have had trouble finding them in the podcast player.
Yes. And we've also gone over that weight piece in there. I know
episode.
In at least one, if not a couple mentions someplace else. So
right. I have one for you and one for, here's a quick one.
Yeah.
Jenny, you wear G6 and so does Arden. Do you ever calibrate on day one if it's off?
No.
You don't, you let it go.
I let it go.
And how do you manage that with your algorithm that you're using?
I manage it by doing finger sticks because I have had, as we talked about right away, I've had diabetes long enough that finger sticks have always been a norm. Even once things got approved for not having to do them anymore, I still do them. So that's my thing. And with the algorithm that I use for my insulin management, I can populate in my finger stick value for my algorithm to use that value rather than the CGM value. And then I get proper dose adjustment.
And you have an Apple iPhone, right?
I do.
So you go
through Apple Health.
You go into the health kit and you tell it, you add your blood sugar there. And then that program you're using.
Yes, it populates it in.
The Loop app will see it and then it knows.
Yes, correct.
And so my way of dealing with it is if it's close, I roll. You know what I mean? Like and I test too. They're advertisers on the show, but we use the Contour X1 meter. I find it to be incredibly accurate. And so in those first number of hours, while the sensor wire's still, baking in, I will test. But I'm going to tell you that if it says she's 70 and she's really, and she's really 90, I might let it go a little longer to see what happens. But there are times I do calibrate to get it together. It's not a frequent thing. I probably only calibrate on day one when I calibrate. But having said that, we don't do it very often at all. We
and there are so many trains of thought in terms of that I've run into in working with people. Some people have got this like system, it works really well for them. Awesome, great. Even if it's not what's recommended, if it's working for you, I'm not going to tell you to stop doing that, right? But from a standpoint of education, we recommend following the recommendations of Dexcom. Don't calibrate in the first 24 hours.
We would never do anything like that. No. Somebody asked for links. I just put them in the comments. And honestly, Jenny and I are not used to being seen. For those of you who are new, I have a podcast called the Juicebox Podcast, and Jenny is a frequent contributor to it. And she's not on every episode. So if you really like her and you hate me, you're going to be pissed when you tune in today and she's not there. But anyway, calibration day one. Actually, that's sort of covered the next question I had for you. There's a person who is excited about algorithm pumping in the future, right? But is worried that because they don't always see their CGM rock solid, and they're afraid of what's going to happen next. What I would say to that is, Arden has definitely done both ways, and it's never been an issue. Like I've never ran around the house going like, oh my God, everyone's going to die because, Dexcom is off and we're using an algorithm. It's a reasonable worry if you've never done it, but once you do it, I don't think it's something you'll think about again. Does that strike you like that?
No, it does. And it's actually a question that I've gotten more than a number of times from people that I work with, especially parents of kids, wondering, well, what about those compression lows, right? What happens if an algorithm is using that and now it's not really low? What will have happened? Well, you know what? Because the system, if you're using one of these hybrid types of systems, whether it's, on the market or yet to be on the market, if you're using one of them, it's going to adjust based on that change in blood sugar that's being seen.
Right.
But most often, especially in this example of a compression low, that writes itself pretty quickly. In fact, you can tell it's a compression low because it looks like your blood sugar is literally like nosedived off of a cliff. Yeah. And then it comes back up very quickly. I mean, you can tell it's wrong. Well, yes, the system will have reacted to that drop in blood sugar. It may have taken away insulin where it was supposed to, but within the quick time frame of it writing itself, that algorithm's also going to write what it took away behind that.
Right.
So I've had sensors that have been off. Thankfully, not very many. My Dexcom, thankfully, has been very accurate for me in all the years I've used it. But I have had compression lows. And since I've been using, this algorithm, I haven't noticed that that's honestly been an issue. I've never had any problems with excessive high blood sugars, or no problems with like strange, odd low blood sugars that shouldn't have been there because of this sensor, issue being off.
Yeah. I hear you. I'm down. I think it works. I mean, I'm not gonna tell you I haven't gone in Arden's room and been like, is she, like, the first thing I do if she's laying on her side, because she wears hers on her, like, her butt, her hips. So I'll touch her hip that she's not laying on, and if it's not there, I'm like, roll over. Just kind of like shove her. And then you'll wait a minute, it comes back. Interesting side note about a compression low with a CGM. The number it's reading is actually correct still, although not indicative of what your blood sugar is. So it's reading your interstitial fluid, which is, freely running through your body. But when you press down, it disperses it. So it's dispersing some of the glucose that
away.
It's reading. So it might tell you your blood sugar is 60 all of a sudden. The truth is, the interstitial fluid around the wire, the glucose value is 60. Your whole body might be 110. But that's why when you roll off of it, after it gets to, the algorithm gets to think a couple more times, it'll come back and tell you, oh no, you're 110, and that's it. How does that, and Jenny makes a great point. If that happens, the worst thing that's going to happen is the algorithm's going to take insulin away. You might get hot, but you might get a little higher, but you're not going to be in a dangerous situation. And that's a great trade-off, I think.
Yeah, it is.
Jenny, I'm going to ask you, somebody jumped on and said that I recently said on the podcast that I don't abide a bad pump site, that I get away from a bad pump site pretty quickly. But she wants to know, how do you know it's not just your period? Or, and so because you and I deal the same way about that. We don't stick around for a second.
No, I don't stick around. And I guess, from a female perspective, if you're like, well, gosh, is this my period, or is it, a bad site or whatever? I mean, most women, not all, but most women have a pretty consistent timing rhythm to their cycles, right? So if you know that it's probably coming into that time, or that it's that time, and your high blood sugars are usually associated with that, you wouldn't necessarily think that this is, unless you haven't changed your, let's say, your settings or your insulin doses as you needed to for this time period. And if you forgot to do that, obviously the high could likely be associated with that. The best way to tell, though, I mean, because even in your period, you could certainly have a bad site, and then it's like two things hitting you at one time. That's not fun either. So
getting hit from both ends.
Right. That's not joyful at all. So, if that's the case, I think regardless for anybody, whether you're male or female, if you've got an odd looking high blood sugar, that shouldn't be there, right? You've done everything you would normally have done, and this is just a weird, all of a sudden you're like double arrow up and you're 2 something. You take a correction.
Right.
And in my case, and what I recommend, if it's not coming down within the next 30, 60 minutes, that site's done.
Yeah.
It is done. I don't play with it. Even if I pull it off and I'm like, well, it doesn't look like, I don't know, whatever the problem was. The cannula is not bent. It's not bloody. It doesn't look weird. Sometimes it might look a little bit wet or maybe leaky. So maybe for some reason the site was like leaking up along the cannula and you didn't really get as much insulin as you should have.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't play with like numbers that aren't where they would normally be.
Right. And there's a couple of ways that, the way I taught myself. So the answer to a lot of these questions ends up being repetition. You do something over and over again, and one day it just makes sense to you. Right. And you don't, you lose that checklist in your head. Like, well, is it this? Is it this? Like, you stop doing that. You just see it, you recognize it, and you go. So before I could recognize it, I would inject with a needle. So if the pump didn't act the way I expected it to, I'd come back with a syringe. Now, if there was no reaction after that, then I was pretty sure that my site was over. Also, last day of a site, or you just put it on and it just never ends up working. Because I know some people switch their pumps and they'll experience a little bit of a high when they put it on. There's a lot of talk about why that is. Part of me thinks in children that it's anxiety. It's that whole thing kind of gets you jacked up a little bit. That could be it. That's what it used to be for Arden. She's obviously much more relaxed around it now, but we've changed the pump this morning. It went on and we did a more aggressive basal rate for the next hour to try to, her blood sugar was good. It was like 110, but to try to mitigate any kind of a rise. Same thing on the other side. If you think it's not working anymore, once you get it back on, you have to really think about it for a second. How long has this site not been working?
Right.
And now I'm just going to slap on a new site and go, oh, everything's fine now because the insulin delivery is back. It's not, because everything for now is for later, and everything that's happening to you now is from before. Insulin's always from before. Go back to the beginning if you're falling in late, but that's really it. Now the next one is more for you. Although people are asking follow-up questions. So hold on. This is great info on inside. Oh, great. Okay, hold on. By the way, there are people in the comments helping each other. Somebody was like, what's a compression low? And before we could explain it, they jumped in it. You guys
awesome.
Jenny, I drew a picture of a lady with a big belly to remind me that someone asked about good tips for thinking about getting pregnant.
Okay. That's great.
I just didn't write down pregnant, but anyway, I'm not showing it. It's not a good drawing, but go ahead.
Okay. Good tips for getting pregnant. So preconception time. We kind of define preconception time, the 3 to 6 months, potentially even a year, up to when you want to start trying to conceive. And the goal there is to aim to get glucose values into the pregnancy target. If you think about and/or don't know what the targets are for pregnancy, the goal is to be under 7%. And then in pregnancy, an A1C more around 6%, within the 5s if the lows aren't the big reason for being in the 5s. Okay. But typically most practices will say under 6.5% through pregnancy, more around 6 is the preferred, just from the standpoint of health of you and the developing baby. For the preconception time, then it's really focusing in quite a lot on what are the variables that you can learn and manage better in your life. And if some of the variables, like every Friday night you eat the whole box of chocolate, ice cream bonbons, and you can't manage around that, you know what? For 9 months, you can manage not eating your bonbons on Friday night. Yeah. I mean, that's, those are the things, those are the strategies that you sort of learn in that preconception time. I mean, the beginning tips really are look at what pregnancy targets for blood sugar should be, because aiming to get those as close preconception will make it so much easier once you're pregnant, because you don't have to shift this whole mental, oh my gosh, now my blood sugar has to be 90 and it's been riding at 150, right?
Don't just count on, I'm going to get knocked up and then I'll do this better. Right. And that probably wasn't the right way to say that, but you know what I mean. Thoughtfully and through love, make a baby, and then try to get better at your blood sugar. Get better first. Prove it to yourself that you can do it over and over again. Jenny, if you had to say to somebody a way they could get better at this, what would you tell them to do?
What would I tell them to do?
Like a web address.
Yes. Well, they can call me.
I just put Jenny's email address in the comments.
They could also, I wrote a book with a good friend of mine, Ginger Vieira, who's written a couple of her own books. It's pregnancy management for type 1 diabetes. You can find it on Amazon. And we actually have a big preconception month-to-month guide for pregnancy management, postpartum, lactation. We've got all of the information in the book. So
I would also bet that sometime this year there might be a pro tip episode about being pregnant with somebody too, because that just sounded like a good idea, and I typed it into our running list of ideas for the podcast.
Awesome.
Yeah. Okay, that's a great answer. I wanted to just say that I think that the once you figure this all out, you get pregnant, you keep your blood sugar super stable and your A1C is nice and low forever. It's going to be difficult, but try not to lose track of it after the baby comes.
Right.
Like, just, you can do it. If you did it then, you could do it forever. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
it's interesting as I interview more and more people over the years to see that some people who have trouble managing their diabetes for themselves don't have trouble managing it for someone else. You have no idea how many people have come on and said, I met somebody and I fell in love and I got married and I wanted to be healthier so that our relationship, or I had a baby and I realized I wanted to do more. That's not specific to diabetes, by the way. It's a very human idea. But yeah, keep putting yourself at the top of your list of things to worry and be concerned.
If you can take care of you, you can take care of other people.
100%, I think. And wait till you see having a baby. It's wonderful. Nothing like having a kid. My wife and I were just sitting around the other night going, we think having these babies was really a good idea. No, we were just joking because they were both being annoying at the same time. People are thanking us, which is very lovely. Thank you very much. We really appreciate that you guys listen. Evan asks a question back about bolusing that I feel like I have something to say. He said, is there anything physiologically wrong with a post-meal spike if it comes down later without extra insulin? Would you try to master that meal? I think you probably can. I mean, unless it was, like you said, well, you know, I can't even say unless it's cereal because I can get cereal right sometimes too. So, yeah, Evan, in my opinion, if you're going up, hanging up, coming back and leveling out again and never getting low, there is a way to get more insulin up front. And you know that, and we talked about it earlier, that really Evan should go back and listen to the beginning of the live, right?
Yeah. And I also think, you know, from the standpoint of that kind of management, what it also leads into longer term, if you consider, for the most part, you're looking at your day, let's say you're using a CGM and you can see how much of the time you're in range and where you want to be. And you're only, let's call them problematic times, are these spikes above where you really would want to be after a meal. But the end result is that you're back in target and that looks awesome to you. Then one, managing the timing, again, it's all about timing the insulin, right? But two, that peak is still leading into your overall A1C, right? It's still leading into time out of range, and those post-meal spikes also lead towards things like some of those, many things people don't want to talk about, but the complications, more of those microvascular complications with these peaks that come into play. The more you can minimize and have more gentle rolls through the day, the better long-term. So
so do your best and keep messing around a little sooner, a little later, a little more, a little less. In there somewhere is the answer. It sounds like he's got the amount right and the timing's off. Listen, Evan, if you don't listen to the podcast, I maintain that most of managing insulin is timing and amount. It's just about getting the right amount in the right place where the need comes in. If you can get more up front to stop that initial spike, it might not have to be that much more. You'd be surprised. It could end up being a couple more minutes of a pre-bolus or another half a unit of insulin or something random like that. And that's still because that momentum from the food is so great at that moment. It'll eat up that insulin. It won't leave you extra on the back end. It'll make you low.
Right.
Hopefully. Julia asked, what do you consider a gentle roll? Did you just use the words gentle roll?
I did.
Okay.
I said more of a
like one of those little Pillsbury things with the.
Oh, no.
Julia, I can talk Jenny. As a matter of fact, if Jenny's husband ever leaves her, we're perfect for each other. What she means is not like sharp up, sharp down. She means like it's cool if you go like this a little bit. By the way, this is so much of what we do is easier when people can see our hands moving. Jenny and my hands move a lot while we're talking on the.
We do. And the funny thing is nobody can ever see like our expressions or anything because it's just all voice that they.
There are times when Jenny goes, I wish people could see what we're doing right now. And I'm like, yeah, they can't. So Rachel, this is the best podcast ever. Thank you for saying though.
Yay.
I asked if in the group earlier, I forgot I would ask here. I've been pumping on Omnipod for 6 months and I've just noticed a pattern. Day 1 runs high, day 2 good, day 3 low. Any ideas how to combat this? More or less insulin. She's heard of the opposite problem Brittany has of day 3 being a little higher. I would say that's, if I see anything, it's day 3 higher. Arden's pumps either work right out to 80 hours or right around
2.5 days.
Yeah, 70. I was going to say right at 70 hours ish. Then I have to start paying attention more.
I've actually personally noticed that when it's not a time factor. It's more of a, when my pod gets to about the 20 unit mark, I can almost guarantee if I continue to use it after that for boluses or anything,
Yeah.
I will ride higher, even though the pump tells me I've delivered the insulin. And it's the same way, it's the same factors, ratios, everything that I've used. It's a dose amount from what I've used Omnipod since 2006. So I've got a lot of experience of years
Yeah.
using it.
I
But
love
for
it. I was telling Jenny the other day, Arden's been using it since 2006.
yeah,
And it's amazing. Like I have nothing bad to say.
yeah.
A number of people asked, they said they have the opposite of the feet on the floor up. They have a feet on, they wake up in the morning and their blood sugar drops pretty drastically. Have you heard about that from anybody?
I've actually not had that as a question.
So then would we consider maybe that the basal leading up to their wake up time is too strong?
The question would be first, which is always my question to people, is your wake up time the same? Because if it is the same and you're noticing that drop as soon as you get out of bed in the morning,
Okay.
then the next thing to do would be try to sleep in and see if the drop happens. Because my guess would be the drop is there because you're getting up at the same time. You think it's because you're getting out of bed, but it's because, as you just said, the basal in the hours preceding that are probably too high, and the drop was going to happen anyway. So if, however, you find that when you wake up in the morning and or sleep in, it's completely different. Let's say the sleep in stays totally stable, and when you wake up and get out, that's when the drop happens.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, it's the complete opposite of what a good majority of people see. It's not saying that it's not your personal experience. I've got friends who have a drop in their blood sugar with adrenaline rather than the typical peak in blood sugar because of adrenaline. So it could be the case. I would say that it's going to be it'll be a little bit harder to maybe manage a drop, because if it's related to when you get out of bed and you're not really wanting to like eat glucose tablets or drink some juice just to stop the drop, the couple of options would be, well, if you can get up at about the same time, you could technically decrease the basal leading into that time so the drop doesn't happen. The only thing there is if you get up later, then you're not really going to need that decreased basal.
Get higher then. Listen,
right.
Because of this whole corona thing, Arden she shifted her life drastically. She's staying up way later and getting up
very late.
Yeah. And so I know if by 6 a.m. I don't take away the power of her basal by half, she's going to be low by 8 o'clock. Like, because her daytime numbers are, the insulin we use during the day is just different than what we use at night. At night, she needs far less. I don't know. I hope that was helpful. Let's say I know I have a drop because I'm not waking up at the same time every day. When I had a normal work schedule, there was no drop when I wake up. So then, Laura, do you have a stronger basal rate in the time you're supposed to be awake? Because if so, then that's it. Your basal is just building up, and you have nothing going on inside of your body that needs resistance from extra insulin then.
Right.
And at that point, a basal could act like a bolus eventually.
Yeah,
right.
It could.
Ooh, I like the way I said that. Well, Melinda, thank you for loving the podcast. Thank you. This morning I was 111, Justin says, when I woke up later in bed and read the news, got up 45 minutes later and went to 72. And that's not, Justin, it's tough. I can't have a conversation, but was that not basal related? Somebody here said they have a new basal program that's called Pandemic. So that's a good point too. Don't just change your settings. You can make a new
make a no profile.
And this is all over. You can switch back to the way it was. I've had to, you know what? I have a question for you, Jenny. This happens sometimes when we do the podcast. Let's do it now. And then I'm going to get to a question about kids and growth hormone. I was interviewing someone today who talked about when they got pregnant, they suddenly needed much less insulin. And I was saying to them, it's interesting because for 3 days before Arden's period, she almost needs no insulin too. And I'm wondering what hormone, we're going to have to figure this out. I know this isn't going to something you're going to know now, but we're going to figure this out and talk about later on the podcast. There must be some hormone that's released for ovulation that must also exist while you're pregnant. And maybe I'm wrong. but I'm going to find out if that's true, because those two things, like a bell went off in my head. I was like, ooh, maybe this is it. Because Arden will, Jenny and I have talked about it privately. Arden will use like almost no insulin for a number of days before some of her periods, not all of them, just to keep things interesting. But do you think, did I just say something you've never thought of before?
No, well, and typically, oops, for some reason you went off my screen. There you are now.
Oh, hi.
Okay. Hi, sorry. I was going to say the hormone that's present in the lead up to your cycle, as well as the hormone that's present, very heavily prevalent in the first part of your pregnancy, in that first trimester up to about like 6 weeks, is progesterone. Your body is having this ramp up, almost up a hill climb. And when you get your period, because your body's like, hey, you're not pregnant. So then the progesterone kind of like falls off the cliff, right? And you come back down to this normal level. So most women, not Arden, but most women have a ride up in blood sugar in the days before their cycle starts. And then it calms down. Same thing in those early weeks of pregnancy. Typically, women will actually see a heightened need for insulin in the first about 6 to 7-ish weeks. And then around 8 weeks of pregnancy, there is a bit of a dip off for a couple of reasons, hormonally and what the body is doing. Why there would be a dip in blood sugar prior to the first day of a cycle, or maybe in the first part of pregnancy when normally most women are experiencing a rise, the hormone drive there, I can't say that it's different. I would have to research that.
Let me give you another variable for this story, and I guess this is me ruining an upcoming episode, but what if the pregnancy didn't last much longer than 8 weeks? Maybe there was something else going on.
Sure.
Yeah.
In fact, that is, if you've had a normal increase in insulin in early pregnancy, and if prior to that 8 to 10-ish week point where usually your insulin needs at least stabilize and or dip down a little bit, if that dip happens sooner, oftentimes it can potentially be an indication of like miscarriage. Only because the hormones are not staying steadily, there's not a steady climb. There's also, in early pregnancy, if you've ever had miscarriage before and or you're just worried, you can always get the HCG hormone tested, which is the early pregnancy hormone that's released that actually gives you that positive result in your home pregnancy test. So that hormone should actually mostly double, sometimes triple in those early weeks of pregnancy, which it tells you is that your pregnancy is progressing the way that it's supposed to.
Okay.
So those hormones, that might have some indicative factor too, but that would be something that's a great question.
Yeah,
I'd have to do a little more research.
I feel like there's more in there to understand. Hey, I want to go back to Justin for a second, talking about getting up and getting low. Justin, I just had a thought. Maybe you should do a basal test day. Maybe you're eating enough to feed a basal rate that's too strong. And that way you sat in bed, you looked at the news and everything. Maybe that is what's happening. Maybe it's not. But if you basal test and find out you're always low, maybe, when I talk about manipulating basal rates, sometimes when you manipulate them too much, Justin, your insulin belongs somewhere else. So you might be, and I could be wrong, but you could be in a situation that a lot of MDI people find themselves in, where when they switch to a pump and they realize that their basal's way wrong, but people are like, oh, I switched to a pump, my blood sugar started going up. Well, it's possible your basal, before was too strong or too weak, one way or the other. And so I guess the way I like to talk about it is, so then what's happening, you can't draw a parallel to the things you think they're attached to. So I don't know, Justin, that's maybe worth a shot. Somebody here said, I've been diabetic for 31 years, Melanie. Hi, and you guys have changed my life. That's lovely. Isn't that nice? It makes Jenny and I feel nice.
And they can see us smile.
Yeah, because we really do smile.
It's actually really nice.
Yeah, because I read those to Jenny, and you probably think we're just all like, just jaded and like, it doesn't matter, but no, it makes everybody really happy.
It does.
Sabo, can type 1 diabetes go into remission? I can answer that one. No, it definitely can't. What's the proper way to basal test? Caroline, in my opinion, it's a long conversation. It's not an easy conversation to have. But Jenny and I have had it in the pro tip episodes. So
Well,
find the
listen.
link, go to diabetesprotip.com and look for the basal testing episode. I'd listen to all of them if I was you, but at least to get to that one. Justin says, like maybe we're on to something. All right. You're good to go for a little longer?
Yeah, I'm great.
Caitlin, my toddler has decided to wait. Where did it go? Somebody else said something. No, Caitlin disappeared. My toddler has decided to pace himself differently during meals, resulting in him dipping down into the 60s mid-meal. I'm concerned about our low percentage has hiked to 6% and wondering if we should make changes.
So if your toddler has now decided to like pick at things, like he or she, I don't know, graze like over the next 1.5 hours instead of like slamming it all down within 15 minutes, maybe
Right.
that was the case. Kids are different. I've got a 3-year-old. They sort of roll and change without telling you they're going to change. So it sounds like the dose is probably not wrong. It would be, again, the timing of the insulin distribution. So if the picking of the food, he or she ends up eating everything, but it's in a slower time frame, if you're on a pump, an extended bolus.
Yeah. So extended bolus, you could do 2 different boluses if you wanted, if that idea scared you. Kenny says try to get them to eat the carbs first or the shorter to help. There's a lot you can manipulate the food. Now you're going to get me into my coma when I'm on stage and I start talking. Too often with diabetes, we think of just one thing. How does the insulin impact the number? But you should be wondering about how the food impacts the insulin, how the food impacts the number, how the insulin impacts the food. Like there's all different sort of perspectives
Angles
you can use to think about it. And one of them in there is the answer. And Marcel makes a good point. Maybe the person who asked if diabetes could go into remission, maybe they were asking about honeymooning. And so back to that, some people really can, maybe we should go over honeymooning real quick, but honeymooning is a spot where you have type 1 diabetes, you have this insulin need, and then sometimes for a day, 3 days, 3 months, I've spoken to people it's gone on for years for, suddenly it feels like their pancreas is shouldering the burden a little more again, and then they call that a honeymoon.
right.
I think that's a fairly good explanation of what honeymooning is. So it does eventually, for most people, go away.
Correct. Eventually you will return to using insulin completely for management.
By go away, I mean your pancreas is gonna give up finally.
Gonna poop out.
Go down like Bugs Bunny eventually.
Yeah.
And then,
for those who are diagnosed as adults, or what we call often call LADA, some adults can actually have a very long honeymoon where they may very well be able to control even without insulin for months at a time after they're initially diagnosed, with just lifestyle changes before they actually start to need to use a basal insulin and eventually a bolus insulin for meal times, etc. So
let me address this one question. Then there's another one here I like that I want to go to. Back to Saba, because he's asking, is there a cure on the horizon in the near future? I don't know that there's any cure in the near future. I have a very simple concept around this. I live with a lot of hope for advancements, but I make decisions day to day like they're never coming, because far too many people I see ignore it, thinking, oh, this will be over soon. My body can take bad management for a little while. That's how I feel about it. I act like it's not going to happen. I'm hopeful, but somewhere in the middle there, I think, is the answer. And Jenny, do you know of any cures on the horizon?
I don't. As there have been long term, there's a lot of research. There's a lot of animal-based studies that show some warrant, some benefit, but 32 years with diabetes, I explicitly remember my doctor telling my parents not to worry, that within 7 years, it was 7 years when I was diagnosed, within 7 years, you won't have to worry about this anymore. And, even into my teen years then, my teen brain even started to tell me, this is like lifelong. Just the hope has always continued to be there that maybe there will be some grand discovery and it'll get through and everybody will benefit from it. I'm hopeful more in technology and where the technology piece is going for helping management. But I'm hopeful, but I don't see it.
I agree.
I hate saying that, but
it sucks to say it, but I'm on the same page with you. And not for any nefarious reason, just that it's
No.
if you go look, I think as a species, we've cured like 8 things. And a few of them are just inoculations. They're not even really cures.
Right.
So I'd live like it's not going to happen with my actions around diabetes, but I'm always hopeful. And here's another thing, not to make light of it though. But somebody said on the podcast recently, no one's going to cure diabetes and you're not going to know about it. It'll be on the news. You'll figure it out, or turn yourself into a mouse, because it seems super easy to cure them from type 1 diabetes. Maybe that's what we should be doing. Looking how to turn people into mice. Huh? Now we're getting somewhere. Yeah, I'm sorry. I feel bad about that. But all right, Mallory says, oh, no, wait, Mallory, I'm sorry. That's not the one I was going to read. Mallory's probably like, damn, they almost got to mine. Kelly said, nearly every night after my son falls asleep, he shoots the 300. I've increased basal by as much as 95%. But once he's there, I can't bring him down until he wakes up. Can I answer first?
Sure. I was like, oh, I can get.
Hold your thought. I'm just going to put something on that you can come through with. Trust me.
Okay. It's probably the same thing I'm going to say.
Because your kid's basal rate is, I'm going to make up a number here, a half a unit an hour, and 95% puts him to a unit an hour, doesn't mean that's how much insulin he needs in that time. So you may have to extend on your pump the amount of basal you're allowed to use to get to the point where you can keep him down, because there is an amount of insulin that will stop that kid's blood sugar from going up and hold him steady. What were you going to say? What I said?
You're so funny. So, pretty much along that line. Yes. Okay. One is you've got data that shows you that this is happening every night, right? You're not like, oh, this is only 2 days and now it's not happening anymore. It sounds like it's every night. So one, insulin needs to change. Mm-hmm. Two, right along with what you said, it's in very low level basal rates, especially in many kids. If you're turning basal up by 95% at a basal that's 0.1, you're not hitting the mark by any means.
Yeah, just and even 0.2.
Right. Yeah. That's not hitting them. And you can even look at it a little further if you take into consideration what's the climb in blood sugar. Let's say the child is starting at a blood sugar of 91 at bedtime and climbing up to 303, right? Mm-hmm. That's a huge increase in blood sugar.
Right.
You can also take a look at, well, what is your correction factor? Most little kids have correction factors somewhere around like 1 unit changes their blood sugar by 150 points or by 200 points. If your kid is climbing 200 points, that little notch up to 0.2, when your kid really needs a whole unit to correct a 200 blood sugar climb,
right? That's
how much you need to change the basal by.
Yeah, here's the thing. You'll hear me say this a lot if you listen to the podcast. You need more insulin. That's it. If you have more insulin, it wouldn't happen. And by the way, for the person who asked about the growth, and by the way, too, for a little kid, that could be growth overnight.
It could be.
Mm-hmm. And for the person who jumped in and said their kid's in the teens and going through growth and they can't keep their blood sugar down, here's my answer for that too. Use more insulin, because there is an amount that will stop it. Trust me, there's an amount. Like, now the question is, how do you get to that amount in a way that doesn't feel frightening, especially for somebody who's now talking about, look, it's supposed to be 0.5. I made it 1. How am I possibly going to go higher than that? That feels frightening. I've told this story on the podcast a long time, so I'm not going to waste it here, but there's an amount you can do. Just find yourself being more aggressive, cover with a fast acting juice if you've gotten too much. But the truth is, if you turn his basal up a little too high, he's not going to go from 300 to -10 out of nowhere, And keep in mind too, that if you see a rise at midnight, that doesn't mean change the basal at midnight. It could mean change the basal at 11 o'clock even, or it could be a little earlier, or a little sooner, depending on how his body or her body reacts to the increase of basal. Just like you putting in a bolus doesn't start working right away, putting in a basal doesn't start working right away. There are more thank yous in here. Those are nice. Thank you. Jen, did you have to go at the top of the hour?
Not at the. I've got about 15 minutes.
Oh, Jenny's giving you her personal time. That's lovely. The takeaway is more insulin mirror. It always is. Kara, I'm glad you think this is awesome. Okay, so she got correction factors thinking about insulin that way. Jeff is saying protein and fat dinners are hitting around dinner time. Okay, Scott, Jamie said, Scott, I've heard you say things about being in an insulin deficit from overnight. I'm pretty sure I understand what you mean. I suspect it's a reason why some people go higher than expected in the morning. It was a light bulb moment for me, so I'm sure others may find it helpful. Anyways, I love you guys to explain what you meant here. I'll let Jenny explain what I meant so I can drink something. I'll say what I mean afterwards. Just you go first. Relax.
So if you're at a basal deficit, essentially you're coming in to a time period when first thing in the morning, most people are trying to put food in right away, right? And if you're coming in at a deficit of insulin behind the scenes, then the impact of that food, even with potentially a pre-bolus, you're still going to rise because there wasn't enough behind it in the hours leading up to that meal time. If you're at a deficit of insulin as well, you're likely seeing that you're riding in at a blood sugar that's higher than you want to be, or it's higher than the target you've had your pump set to keep you at. Mm-hmm. And that's a telltale sign right there. And that's only then going to lead into that meal time also causing more of a rise up than you want, because you're already starting higher than you wanted to begin with.
I would, and I think of it, if you want a different way to think about it, it's like eating a meal without a pre-bolus, right? Because there's just, if you don't pre-bolus a meal, you start eating, that the food's going to win way before the insulin starts working. Same idea, like Jenny said, people jump out of bed and they eat. And, we just explained to the last person that you put a basal rate on at, not at midnight for a jump up at midnight. So if you're getting up at 7 in the morning and beginning to eat right away, your blood sugar's jumping up. It's possible your basal needs to be stronger starting at 6 a.m. and you still have to pre-bolus. It's not all the basal. You're going to have to pre-bolus and you're going to have the basal, right? It's all just the timing and amount. Mm-hmm. Everything you see with type 1 diabetes, in my opinion, is about the balance of insulin and using it when it's needed. And you have to be able to step back sometimes to see the bigger picture. People get hyper focused on what's happening in the moment. I get up in the morning and my blood sugar gets high. That's it. Then they stop there. It's not about that. It's about before. Now, this is going to be the third time I said it. Everything you do now with insulin is for later. But remember, now is always some other times later.
Right.
That's how Arnold Schwarzenegger tried to kill those people in that movie, right? Time travel. Yes. Yeah, that's all.
I think the other part of it too is that there's a very emotional level to managing your diabetes or managing somebody that you love's diabetes, right? And so as hard as it can be, sometimes you have to step outside of yourself and you have to kind of say, especially for the person who's managing their own diabetes, you kind of have to step back, take the emotion out and say, okay, I'm high. I really don't love being high, but I'm high. Let's look at the information and see what I can do to fix it, right? Sometimes taking that emotional piece out of it also makes you think a lot clearer about what you want to do. I mean, that's the big reason for rage bolusing, right? That's the big reason. Like, darn it, I'm high. Let's get this down.
I maintain that I'm as good at this as I am because it's not happening to me. If I had type 1 diabetes, I wouldn't have this podcast. I'd be a mess. I'd be on the floor with my 10A1C going, I don't know what's happening. But it was,
I don't think so.
Right? Like, no, I don't know. Like I it's for her so that I'm able to be more aggressive because I have a bigger fear of letting her down than I would of letting myself down, I think. So a lot of the things you'll hear about on the podcast, which by the way, you can listen to on any podcast app absolutely for free. Just search for Juicebox Podcast. There's over 325 episodes. The podcast has been up for almost 6 years. If you don't have a podcast app, they should be free. If you can't find one, go to juiceboxpodcast.com, scroll to the bottom. There are links to all your different phones to get you on. And someone just asked the question here, how to manage unexpected activity, but a bunch of people just jumped in and said, have a snack, decrease your basal. Yeah, that's it. And Allison, somebody said was amazing. I'm going to assume it was me and we'll just move on. I don't really know what she's talking about. So they're talking about that. They're talking about activity around all this. Also, I want to bring up around, a lot of people stress, anxiety, or a sudden sedentary lifestyle because you're not going to work anymore, all those ideas. Somebody in here asked about, they said their blood sugar's jumping up at night, not always since the pandemic has started. And I wonder if when your brain slows down after your day's over, do you not find yourself thinking or worrying about coronavirus? Because stress, anxiety, pain, there are a lot of things that can make your blood sugar go up. So
Yes.
I would look into that a little bit.
In fact, it's really funny that you bring that up because somebody that I work with, she actually just emailed me. It has nothing to do with diabetes, but my brain was right away like bringing diabetes into the picture, reading it. It's all about dreams since coronavirus became the thing that it is.
Yeah.
And the fact that dreams they are the way that our mental self kind of manages through things. And we can learn some things, if your dreams are kind of scary or if they're really scary or if they're just sort of like hinting at weird things, it's the way that your body manages to sort of work through some of the thoughts that it didn't have in the daytime, right? Or that were sort of in the background. And with diabetes in the picture, some of those can be very stress inducing in the overnight time period. So, if you're looking at, many of your overnight values and you're thinking, well, why this night was really weird. I had this big strange rise and I woke up high and that's usually not happening for you. Maybe you had a horrible dream about something that, and it's not consistent
About
enough
never
to make a
hugging
change.
another person again.
Right. It could be. I mean, after all this started, I had a horrible dream about zombies.
Did you?
Horrible. Like I woke up in like a panic. And I don't remember many of my dreams. I usually sleep pretty soundly. This dream had me like, I was like up and I was like, where's the zombies?
Well, Natalie just jumped in and said playing video games makes her teenage son's levels go up. That's adrenaline, I would imagine. Yeah. And Natalie, I bet you they come back down again, right? And because that's another thing. So stress, anxiety, those sorts of things are always going to, always have the ability to impact you. I'm sure there's some people who get stressed out and their blood sugars don't go up, but it does happen to a number of people. Enough it's worth paying attention to.
Yeah. And sometimes you can address the rise if you know that it's not going to come down. Sometimes you have to correct for it. Many times adrenaline rises, though, you often don't have to touch. Oftentimes, once that stress factor, the adrenaline like surge sort of passes, you'll see things come back down.
It's funny. Somebody jumped in as you were making this and said, a bad dream could make your blood sugar go up at night. Mira said, and there are people, my daughter's goes up with Xbox. So if, listen, it's not the easiest thing to, I guess, schedule, but if Xbox time is going to be in a certain place, you probably could do a temp basal increase. And that would
or kind of like weightlifters. If you've watched enough to know how much blood sugar typically rises during Xbox use, you could technically take an amount of insulin as a bolus to offset the typical rise that you see based on what your correction factor is.
Let's see if we can get one more thing in.
Sure.
If we have to go. So somebody asked about their Dexcom user and they're talking about pre-bolusing and when do you know when to start eating? So for my daughter, in a perfect situation, I like to see a diagonal down arrow before she starts eating. And you also have to get right in your head what's high and what's low too. For me, I don't want my daughter, I try very hard for Arden not to go under 70. That's my goal. And I try for not to go over 120. Do we always do that? We do not always do that. A number of times a day, she ends up higher. It just happens sometimes. Okay. All the things that you just heard about happen to us too. My daughter's A1C has been between 5.2 and 6.2 for almost 6 years, but she got out of bed, didn't have enough insulin going because she slept in, tried to eat something with a lot of carbs, and her blood sugar's 200 right now. And we're going to get it back down as fast as we can without it getting low. You're not shooting for perfection. You're just shooting for as much time and range as you can get in there. Right. But back to the initial question, I like to see a diagonal down arrow, but now I know how fast the food's going to hit her too. So you just have to practice, right? Like start at 100, put in the blood sugar. When you get to 91 diagonal down, eat, see what happens. Did you go up to 150, but then level back out? Cool. Maybe you could have waited till 85 diagonal down. Maybe that would have taken you to 130. So it's just trial and error. You have to go over and over again.
Experience teaches you a fair amount. Mm-hmm.
John, I don't know that Jenny knows this answer, but I'll ask her before she goes. John wants to know if you know what factors affect the hypoglycemic risk value on the Dexcom Clarity app. Do you know what it takes into account to come up with that? I don't.
I don't, but my assumption is that it calculates the percentage of time that you've been low within the time frame that you're looking at to classify what your risk is. If you're 1% of the time low, I guarantee that your risk factor for low is not high.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're pretty consistently at 10% low, even if it's not the really red low, it's just that pink low, right? Because there's a different designation. Yeah. The red low is like under 55 is the red low, right? But I mean, if you're really low pretty consistently, that risk factor obviously goes up. I don't know exactly what parameters they're using to establish that percentage value for you. But yeah.
All right. So we'll roll through these last three. Jamie brought up that if she waits for a diagonal down arrow for her kid, it goes lower. So it's going to be different for everybody. Yeah. Lisa is saying hello to us from Sweden and said we've both been very helpful in her first 6 months of being a type 1 mom. Hi, Sweden. That's cool. And Stu asks, do we recommend the InPen, which I think we both do?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. If you can't pump, you can get a lot of the knowledge that a pump has from InPen, pairing with their InPen app and your glucose monitor, and even a meter. Not as much. Look, and Jenny's holding one right there.
I've got the pink. You can get them in different colors too.
Yeah, I've got a blue one here somewhere, but it's a demo. So
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So listen, Jenny was only supposed to be here for an hour. It's 4:09. She got to go back to her life. I want to say that at one point this was up to 120 people and it never got below 80, even 15 minutes after it was supposed to be over. So
awesome.
Really appreciate all you guys. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. If you enjoy the podcast, please share it with somebody else. It's the only way it can grow. I do not have money to do any kind of meaningful advertising for the show. In the last comment here again is Jenny's email address. You can hire Jenny. She works at Integrated Diabetes Services. You can have one-on-one calls just like this with her. Check it out. See if your insurance has covered it, or if you want to pay cash or whatever you want to do. Jenny is very cool. She is 100% my diabetes spirit animal. I've never heard her say one thing that I was like, that's wrong. But as I've mentioned on the podcast before, that might just be my narcissism because she agrees with me. I think she's terrific, but
thanks.
Who knows exactly, This will be available on the podcast soon, and it'll be running on juiceboxpodcast.com as well. And it stays here on Facebook. So thank you, everybody, very much. And I hope you guys have a great day. And Jenny, I really appreciate you doing this. Thank you.
Yeah, no, this was great. And thanks to everybody who commented back and forth to each other as we were answering. It's a great way to help each other. So
yeah, very cool. All right, guys.
Thanks.
Wash your hands. Stay safe. Bye.
Bye.